Since the coup in Burkina Faso, one name has spread across Africa and beyond: Ibrahim Traore. But why? Why does the West tremble when his name is mentioned? Why do millions of young Africans see him as a hero, a warrior, a new Thomas Sankara? And what exactly has he done that terrifies the world's most powerful nations? To answer this, we must step back, far back, to understand not just the story of one man, but the story of an entire continent rising. For centuries, Africa was controlled, carved up, and exploited. Colonizers drew borders, stole resources, and built systems designed to keep Africa weak and dependent. When independence came, it was only partial. Flags changed, anthems changed, but the chains remained. France kept its grip on West Africa through military bases, unfair trade, and the infamous CFA franc, a colonial currency that gave Paris control over African economies. The United States and Europe positioned themselves as partners, but in reality, they were gatekeepers of aid and loans. And when African leaders dared to resist, they were toppled, assassinated, or punished with sanctions. This was the world that Ibrahim Traore was born into, a world where foreign powers ruled from the shadows, and African leaders were often too afraid, or too compromised, to fight back. But that world was about to change. In 2022, frustration in Burkina Faso reached its breaking point. Terrorism was spreading, villages were unsafe, corruption weakened the government, and above all, many felt that their leaders had become puppets of France, unable or unwilling to act in the interest of the people. Then, a group of young soldiers made their move. At their head was a man in his early 30s, wearing no fancy suit, no crown, no polished words, just a military uniform and the determination of someone who believed in his people. His name? Captain Ibrahim Traore. The coup shocked the world. Western governments immediately condemned it. Analysts said Burkina Faso would spiral into chaos, but on the streets, the people celebrated. To them, this was not just a change of power, it was a liberation. But this was only the beginning. From the very first days of his leadership, Traore made decisions that broke with decades of submission. Welcome to African Spotlight 24, your premier source for news and current affairs from across the continent.
Burkina Faso, a landlocked country in the Sahel, had long been trapped in poverty, insecurity, and the grip of neo-colonial control. For decades, France, the former colonial power, maintained a powerful influence over the nation. French troops were stationed in the country under the pretext of fighting terrorism. The economy was tied to the French-backed CFA franc, a currency that limited true independence. And political leaders who dared to challenge this system often found themselves isolated, overthrown, or worse. But by 2022, the people of Burkina Faso had reached their breaking point. Terrorist attacks were increasing. Villages were being massacred. Ordinary people felt abandoned, not protected. The government led by Paul-Henri Damiba, who had himself come to power through a coup earlier that year, failed to deliver stability. That's when a young military officer, Ibrahim Traore, decided enough was enough. Backed by disillusioned soldiers and a population desperate for change, Traore seized power. Unlike many who came before him, he did not speak the language of compromise or gradual reform. From day one, his message was bold, uncompromising, and clear. Burkina Faso would stand on its own feet, free from foreign domination. What made this even more powerful was his age. At just 34 years old, Traore represented a new generation of African leadership. While many African leaders were in their 60s, 70s, and even 80s, clinging to power, repeating the same colonial-era patterns, Traore was different. He spoke directly to the youth, the majority of Africa's population. He declared that Africa's future would no longer be dictated by outsiders, but by Africans themselves. His speeches resonated deeply, not just in Burkina Faso, but across the entire continent. When Traore spoke about dignity, sovereignty, and freedom, millions of Africans from Dakar to Lagos, from Johannesburg to Nairobi, saw in him a reflection of their own struggles. But Traore's rise was not just about inspiring words. It was about action, swift and decisive. Within weeks of taking power, he began reshaping Burkina Faso's political direction in ways that terrified Western powers. France thought it would rule Burkina Faso forever. But Ibrahim Traore had other plans. Within months of taking power, the young captain made moves so bold that Paris, Brussels, and Washington could hardly believe what they were seeing. For the first time in decades, an African leader was not begging the West for help. He was showing them the door. One of Traore's first and most shocking decisions was to order the withdrawal of French troops from Burkina Faso. For years, France had justified its presence under the banner of fighting terrorism. But to many Burkinabe citizens, the reality was different. Terrorism kept spreading, villages remained unsafe, and the French presence looked less like protection and more like occupation. So Traore did what no leader before him dared to do. He demanded that French forces pack their bags and leave. And he gave them just 1 month to withdraw. This was not a polite request. It was an ultimatum. The move sent a powerful message across Africa. Here was a leader unafraid of confronting the former colonial power. To the people of Burkina Faso, it was a moment of pride, a reclaiming of sovereignty. Crowds cheered in the streets. Citizens marched with signs declaring support for Traore and shouting slogans against France. But in Paris, this was nothing short of a nightmare. France had already lost influence in Mali after a similar expulsion of its troops. Now Burkina Faso was following the same path. And worse, this boldness was spreading like wildfire across the Sahel region. But Traore didn't stop there. He went after the very heart of France's control over African economies, the CFA franc. For decades, 14 African nations had been forced to use this French-backed currency, which gave Paris enormous power over their economies. Critics called it a colonial relic, a system designed to keep African countries dependent. Traore openly questioned the CFA franc. He declared that Burkina Faso and Africa as a whole needed a new path, one that would free them from the economic chains of colonialism. His government began discussions with neighboring countries on alternatives, including the possibility of a new Pan-African currency. For Western powers, this was terrifying. Economic independence meant less control, less leverage, and the risk of Africa charting its own destiny outside of Western institutions. Another move that shook the West was Traore's pivot in international alliances. Instead of leaning on France, the European Union, or even the United States, Traore turned to new partners: Russia, Turkey, and China. With Russia, Burkina Faso deepened military cooperation. Russian instructors and advisors arrived to train Burkinabe forces. Discussions about arms deals and security partnerships intensified. With Turkey, talks of infrastructure projects and trade agreements grew. With China, doors opened for investment in energy, mining, and construction. To the West, this looked like a geopolitical earthquake. The traditional dominance of France in the Sahel was being dismantled brick by brick, and Traore was at the center of it. But perhaps the most symbolic and terrifying gesture came when Traore began to speak openly about Pan-African solidarity. He declared that Burkina Faso would no longer be a pawn of foreign powers. Instead, it would work with neighbors like Mali and Niger to build a stronger, self-reliant Sahel. In fact, in 2023, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger announced the creation of the Alliance of Sahel States, AES, a new regional bloc that challenged the dominance of ECOWAS, the West African regional body, often influenced by Western pressure. This was more than politics. It was symbolism. It was Africa saying, "We don't need you anymore. We can stand together." And that, more than anything, terrified the West. Because if Burkina Faso, a small and relatively poor nation, could take such bold steps, what would happen if larger African countries followed the same path? For the first time in modern history, Africa is choosing its own friends. And leading that choice is a young captain from Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traore. While Western powers scramble to hold on to influence, Traore is forging new alliances, uniting African nations, and inspiring millions across the continent and the diaspora. To the West, this is a nightmare. But to Africa, it feels like the beginning of a revolution. After the coup and his bold rejection of France, Traore began looking not just within Burkina Faso, but across the region. He knew that a single country standing alone could be isolated, punished, or even destabilized. But if nations stood together, their strength would multiply. This vision led to the birth of the Alliance of Sahel States, AES, in 2023. a coalition of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. These three nations, all led by military governments that had broken away from France's orbit, came together with a simple but powerful idea: unity. They pledged mutual defense, economic cooperation, and the building of a new regional order free from foreign interference. To many Africans, this was more than an alliance. It was a statement of independence, a declaration that Africa was no longer willing to be dictated to by Paris, Brussels, or Washington. But Traore didn't stop at regional cooperation. He began speaking of a broader vision, a Pan-African unity that would stretch beyond borders. In his speeches, he invoked the legacies of figures like Thomas Sankara, Burkina Faso's revolutionary leader of the 1980s who dreamed of a self-reliant Africa. He echoed the words of Kwame Nkrumah, Ghana's founding father, who once declared that Africa must unite or perish. And he spoke to the youth, the millions of young Africans who make up the majority of the continent. His message was simple: Africa does not have to be poor. Africa does not have to be divided. Africa does not have to bow to foreign powers. This message resonated far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. From Mali to Nigeria, from South Africa to the Caribbean, people began to see Traore not just as a national leader, but as a symbol of resistance, pride, and possibility. At the same time, Traore worked to strengthen ties with global powers outside the West. With Russia, military and strategic cooperation expanded. Wagner instructors trained Burkinabe soldiers, while discussions about future economic deals took place. With Turkey, talks of trade, energy, and infrastructure projects grew stronger. With China, Burkina Faso looked toward investment in construction, mining, and energy, tapping into Beijing's vast resources.
We're glad you're here. If you're new to our channel, please subscribe, like, and turn on notification to stay up to date with the latest news and analysis. Your support helps us reach more people. Disclaimer: the content of this video is based on credible, publicly available information and is intended for educational, analytical, and informational purposes only. African Spotlight 24 does not promote hate, violence, misinformation, or political unrest. Our goal is to deliver thoughtful insights, highlight local voices, and encourage informed conversations throughout Africa.